The year is 1834. The Palace of Madrid is shrouded in the quiet that follows a king's death. But for one man, the work is far from over. He is a royal physician, and he has been summoned to the private chambers of the late Ferdinand VII for a task so bizarre, so unprecedented, that it walks the fine line between duty and nightmare. The Queen Regent, Maria Cristina, stands before him, her eyes glistening with tears that speak of a complex grief. Her request chills his blood. His hands, trained for healing, tremble as he approaches the bed where the king's body lies in state. Even in death, the man who terrorized Spain for 2 decades seems to radiate a cruel mockery from beyond the grave. But it is not the king's face, frozen in final repose, that holds the physician's horrified gaze. It is what lies beneath the silk sheets, the thing that defined his reign as much as his cruelty, his paranoia, or his betrayals. The anatomical monstrosity that historians would whisper about for centuries, but never dare commit to their official accounts. Ferdinand's member, his grotesquely oversized, bizarrely shaped endowment that was simultaneously the source of his deepest shame and his most twisted pride. As the physician begins the grim preservation process, his mind reels. He is not just embalming flesh and blood. He is preserving the physical embodiment of a reign that was itself deformed, oversized, and ultimately destructive to everything it touched. Whispers echo in his memory, tales of special cushions, of screaming wives, of desperate attempts to produce an heir despite nature's most cruel joke. To understand the king's shame, one must first understand that Ferdinand VII was born cursed, not by witchcraft or divine wrath, but by the poisonous legacy of centuries of royal inbreeding. The Spanish Habsburgs and Bourbons had spent generations marrying cousins to cousins, uncles to nieces, weaving a genetic nightmare that manifested in mental instability, physical deformities, and early deaths. Ferdinand emerged from this toxic bloodline like a living embodiment of royal decay. Born at El Escorial Palace on October 14, 1784, he was the product of Charles IV and Maria Luisa of Parma, a couple whose own marriage was an arrangement between first cousins. The genetic lottery had been rigged from the start, and Ferdinand would pay the price in the most intimate and humiliating way possible. As he grew from child to adolescent, it became terrifyingly clear that nature had played a particularly vicious trick on the future king. His member began developing in ways that defied all medical understanding. By his teenage years, court physicians were already whispering behind closed doors about the royal anomaly, a sexual organ so massive and strangely shaped it seemed almost alien in its proportions. Hidden medical records, sealed in Vatican archives for centuries, describe it in clinical terms that nonetheless convey a sense of horror. One physician wrote of its extraordinary dimensions and peculiar form, while another was brutally blunt, comparing it to a billiard cue. Thin as sealing wax at its base, thick as a man's fist at its extremity, and long enough to serve as a walking stick. The psychological impact on the young prince was devastating. In an era where male anatomy was judged by classical Greek standards, where smaller, refined proportions were considered aristocratic and ideal, Ferdinand's massive member marked him as a freak. The very thing that might be envied in a different context became a source of profound, isolating shame. This humiliation was the forge in which his tyrant's heart was hammered. His father, Charles IV, was weak-willed, preferring hunting to ruling. His mother, Maria Luisa, was a woman of voracious appetites who openly flaunted her affair with the kingdom's de facto ruler, Manuel de Godoy. Young Ferdinand watched this daily spectacle of humiliation, absorbing bitter lessons about power, betrayal, and the fragility of trust. But it was his physical abnormality that truly sculpted his character. The court buzzed with barely suppressed whispers. Servants giggled behind their hands. Courtiers made subtle, cutting jokes. Foreign diplomats included reports on the Spanish embarrassment in their dispatches. Ferdinand learned, with the acute sensitivity of the perpetually mocked, that he was an object of ridicule. His most intimate self was a source of amusement for others. This bred a deep, festering resentment that would later manifest in his treatment of an entire nation. He began to see mockery everywhere, in a respectful bow, in a formal address, in the arranged smile of a potential bride. His paranoia was not entirely unfounded. People were laughing at him, just not always to his face. His behavior turned secretive, vindictive, and cruel. An incident, recorded by a court chaplain, reveals the darkness festering within him. A young page accidentally walked in on the prince changing clothes. Ferdinand didn't simply dismiss him. He had the boy flogged and his entire family exiled from Madrid. The message was chillingly clear. No one could witness the prince's shame and escape punishment. As Ferdinand reached marriageable age, the full daunting extent of his anatomical challenge became clear to the royal physicians. Dr. Francisco Flores left behind secret notes that provide a disturbing window into reality. His Majesty's member presents a most unusual configuration. The base measures no more than the width of a man's thumb, yet it expands to a circumference that defies natural proportion. The length exceeds that of any recorded human specimen, near to 10 inches, with a peculiar curvature and the presence of what appear to be additional tissue growths. Normal intimacy would be impossible. The royal craftsmen were secretly commissioned to create what were euphemistically called marital aids, specially designed cushions and supports to allow Ferdinand to function sexually without causing serious injury. In 1802, Ferdinand married his first cousin, Princess Maria Antonia of Naples and Sicily. She arrived in Madrid a beautiful, intelligent teenager, filled with romantic notions about her husband, who was called El Deseado, the desired one, by his supporters. The wedding was a magnificent spectacle, but royal weddings end, and wedding nights begin. The first sign of trouble was the arrival of the custom-made cushions, bottles of oils, and strange implements that seemed more medical than romantic. Maria Antonia, sheltered and innocent, understood none of it. When Ferdinand entered the bridal chamber, the princess's first glimpse of her husband's naked form sent her into hysterical screams. Witnesses described her backing against a wall, pointing and crying, "Monster! Monster!" until they feared she had lost her reason entirely. What followed was less a romantic union than a traumatic medical procedure. Ferdinand's physicians had to be called in to explain the horrific reality to the terrified young woman. The custom cushions were arranged, oils applied, and a process began that was more akin to surgery than lovemaking. Maria Antonia required laudanum, a powerful opiate, simply to endure it. Their attempts to produce an heir became a ritualized nightmare. A summons from the king would lead to physicians preparing the chamber. Maria Antonia would be dosed into compliance. The clinical, distressing procedure would be performed, after which both would retreat to separate wings of the palace to recover. Months turned to years without a pregnancy. Ferdinand's desperation curdled into cruelty. He became convinced her disgust was preventing conception. He ordered special leather and silk restraints crafted to hold her in position. He consulted astrologers, mystics, and purveyors of fertility potions, spending fortunes on ground rhinoceros horn and powdered pearls. Miraculously, she became pregnant twice. The court rejoiced. Spain held its breath. But both pregnancies ended in devastating miscarriages that left her physically broken and deeply addicted to laudanum. Ferdinand's reaction revealed his profound selfishness. Rather than compassion, he accused her of sabotaging the pregnancies deliberately, of harboring secret liberal sympathies that made her unwilling to provide a Catholic heir. These accusations destroyed the last of Maria Antonia's mental health. She died in May 1807 at just 21 years old. The official cause was fever. The truth was, she died of despair, her body and mind destroyed by years of sexual trauma, addiction, and psychological abuse. And as she was laid to rest, Ferdinand, relieved of his failed tool, was already making inquiries for a new wife. Ferdinand's return to Spain in 1814 was met with a euphoria unlike anything Europe had ever witnessed. After 6 years of brutal war against Napoleon, the people threw flowers, wept with joy, and fell to their knees as his carriage passed through Madrid. They saw in him not a man, but a symbol, the desired king who would restore their nation's glory. But inside that carriage, the man himself was preoccupied. His first priority was not governing the shattered nation, not rewarding the brave souls who had fought for his restoration, but finding a new wife. The quest for an heir, that singular obsession born from his deepest shame, consumed him utterly. Even as Spain began the painful process of rebuilding, its king was commissioning the finest craftsmen in Europe to create a new, more elaborate set of marital aids, turning the royal workshop into a laboratory of perverted ingenuity. His choice fell upon another cousin, Maria Isabel of Portugal. She was 19 in 1816, arriving at the Spanish court with the same naive hope that had characterized her predecessor. This time, however, the court physicians had attempted to better prepare the situation, briefing her ladies-in-waiting on the special preparations required. But no description could ever brace a human being for the reality of Ferdinand's anatomical nightmare. The wedding itself was a spectacle of Baroque excess, a desperate attempt to mask the growing dysfunction at the heart of the monarchy. Ferdinand stood at the altar, a mask of barely contained anxiety over a cloth of gold suit. He had spent the previous week in frantic consultation with physicians, alchemists, and even a mysterious Ottoman specialist, rumored to have expertise in royal difficulties. The wedding night was a catastrophe that would haunt the palace for years. Despite all the preparations, the specialized devices, and the international consultations, Ferdinand's condition proved insurmountable. The screams that echoed through the corridors were not of passion, but of pure, unadulterated terror and pain. Servants later discovered blood-stained sheets and broken furniture, the evidence of a coupling that resembled a medieval torture session more than a romantic union. Isabel never recovered from that first night. She developed a pronounced stutter, would flinch at Ferdinand's entrance into a room, and was plagued by hysterical episodes and nightmares where she screamed about the monster that haunted her. Ferdinand, in his twisted logic, interpreted her terror not as a rational response to trauma, but as a personal insult to his royal dignity. His paranoia, already a defining trait, metastasized. He became convinced she was conspiring with foreign powers to mock his condition. Her correspondence was intercepted, her food tasted for poisons, her chambers searched for evidence of betrayal. The king's sexual dysfunction had now fully erupted into a political psychosis that infected his entire rule. The pressure to produce an heir became a national obsession, a dark cloud hanging over the court. Ferdinand commissioned increasingly bizarre medical consultations, bringing together physicians, anatomists, and even circus performers who claimed expertise in unusual anatomical challenges. The royal bedchamber was transformed into a grotesque medical theater, where German anatomists and French physicians were invited to observe the king's intimate failures, taking detailed notes and making sketches that were later circulated among European medical schools. The most private shame of the Spanish king had become a subject of academic study across the continent. Subjected to this parade of voyeuristic humiliation, Queen Isabel began a rapid psychological collapse. She stopped eating, developed a 1,000-yard stare, and became a ghost, haunting her own palace. The political consequences of this personal tragedy became impossible to ignore. Spain's American colonies, already in revolt, seized upon the king's inability to produce an heir as potent propaganda. They painted him as a sexually impotent tyrant, his physical inadequacies a perfect mirror for his political incompetence. Ferdinand's most intimate shame had become a rallying cry for independence movements from Mexico to Argentina. His response was characteristically paranoid and brutal. He launched a new wave of purges, targeting anyone suspected of spreading rumors or supporting colonial independence. The Inquisition, which he had restored, began investigating cases of sexual slander against the crown, creating a climate where even a private joke between spouses could lead to imprisonment. The king's obsession with secrecy reached absurd heights. He ordered the construction of hidden passages throughout the palace to move unseen, and had mirrors installed to detect eavesdroppers. He employed a network of spies whose sole job was to monitor palace gossip about the royal marriage. Amidst this, Isabel's health continued to deteriorate. She began experiencing phantom pregnancies, periods where she exhibited all the signs of being with child despite the biological impossibility. These episodes provided Ferdinand with cruel bursts of hope, followed by crushing disappointment that would plunge him into black depressions, paralyzing the government for weeks. In 1818, after 2 years of this unending nightmare, Maria Isabel of Portugal found her escape in death. She succumbed to what court physicians diplomatically called nervous exhaustion, though private letters suggest she may have hastened her own end through subtle self-harm. Her final words were a prayer of gratitude for her liberation. Ferdinand's reaction to her death revealed the complete breakdown of his sanity. Rather than mourning, he became convinced she had been murdered by enemies seeking to prevent him from producing an heir. He ordered multiple autopsies, searched for poison, and had her ladies-in-waiting arrested. His grief was indistinguishable from his paranoia. The funeral was a macabre spectacle. Ferdinand insisted on viewing the body multiple times, touching the corpse and muttering about the wasted potential of her womb. He commissioned a death mask and displayed it in his private chambers, where visitors reported seeing him conduct conversations with the lifeless face of his deceased wife. Yet, his quest for an heir could not be delayed by grief or madness. Within months of her burial, his advisors were negotiating for a third wife. The challenge was immense. Finding a European princess willing to marry a king whose previous 2 wives had met such grim fates and whose personal peculiarities were now legendary across the continent. Several potential brides withdrew after discreet consultations with physicians who had served at the Spanish court. The personal dysfunction of the king had escalated into a full-blown diplomatic crisis. The search for a third queen led to Maria Josefa Amalia of Saxony. In 1819, she arrived in Madrid, older, more worldly, and crucially, better prepared than her predecessors. Her family's desperate financial situation had overruled any concerns about Ferdinand's notorious reputation. Saxon physicians had briefed her thoroughly, and she approached her royal duty not with romantic hope, but with clinical detachment, treating it as a medical and political problem to be solved. She brought her own collection of medical devices and a personal physician, turning the impending marital ordeal into a matter of scientific methodology. The wedding was a subdued, weary affair, devoid of the previous celebrations. Everyone was merely going through the motions of a ritual that had already failed twice. The third marriage settled into a chilling new pattern. Scheduled, medically supervised attempts at intimacy that resembled sterile surgical procedures more than any form of human connection. Maria Josefa kept meticulous records of these sessions, noting times, techniques, and outcomes with the precision of a research scientist. Her clinical detachment, however, seemed to frustrate Ferdinand even more than the outright terror of his previous wives. He began to suspect she viewed him not as a husband, but as a fascinating medical curiosity, and his paranoia expanded to include fears that she was secretly documenting his condition for foreign intelligence services. While the king obsessed over these intimate failures, Spain continued its collapse. The American colonies achieved independence one by one, severing the empire's economic lifeblood. Cabinet meetings were postponed when Ferdinand was having a difficult period, and crucial state decisions were delayed for weeks while he consulted physicians about new conception techniques. The Spanish people, who had once greeted him as a savior, now starved while he spent fortunes on sexual aids and foreign consultants. Then, in 1829, the impossible happened. After a decade of clinical matrimony, Maria Josefa became pregnant. The news sent shockwaves through the court and across Europe. Some spoke of divine intervention. Others credited medical science. The most cynical whispered of infidelity. Ferdinand's reaction was a volatile mix of euphoria and sheer terror. He hired additional guards, brought in Europe's finest physicians, and had her chambers blessed by every religious authority in Madrid. He was convinced enemies would use supernatural or scientific means to sabotage his long-awaited heir. The pregnancy progressed normally until the 7th month, when the Queen began experiencing complications modern medicine would recognize as placental abruption. But Ferdinand's chaotic interference, insisting on consulting mystics and alchemists alongside doctors, made effective care impossible. On May 18, 829, Maria Josefa went into premature labor. The delivery was a horror show, made worse by Ferdinand personally supervising despite having no medical knowledge. The baby, a daughter, lived only a few hours. Maria Josefa survived the trauma but died 3 weeks later, likely from infection and despair. Ferdinand's sanity finally shattered. He refused to allow the bodies to be buried, demanding his physicians perform impossible resurrections. For nearly a week, the palace festered with the stench of decay as the king denied reality. When he finally accepted their deaths, he fell into a profound depression, staring for days at the death masks of all 3 of his wives, a living ghost in his own crumbling palace. But fate had one final, cruel joke to play. Later that same year, his advisors presented him with a 4th bride, Maria Cristina of Naples. Desperate for stability, they had arranged the match. What they failed to mention until negotiations were complete was that Maria Cristina was already visibly pregnant by another man. The 1829 wedding was a farce that fooled no one. Ferdinand, in his ultimate desperation for an heir, willingly accepted this blatant deception, convincing himself that divine providence had finally answered his prayers in an unconventional way. The birth of Isabella II in 1830 should have been his triumph. Instead, it became the source of his final, all-consuming torment. He knew the child was not his, yet he had to maintain the fiction. His relationship with Maria Cristina was built on a foundation of mutual deception, and so the aging king continued his pathetic attempts at intimacy, hoping to produce a true heir of his own blood. His efforts witnessed by the same parade of specialists, now even more futile with his advancing age. The paranoia that consumed Ferdinand's final years manifested in ways that shocked even his most cynical courtiers. He conducted random, armed midnight raids on his wife's chambers, bursting through doors to catch her in imagined acts of treason. He had peepholes drilled into the walls between their rooms, spending hours watching her most private moments, nursing their daughter, praying, simply sitting, like a demented voyeur. Maria Cristina, aware of this constant surveillance, moved through her rooms like a prisoner, every gesture controlled. Food-tasting rituals became elaborate ceremonies of suspicion, delaying meals for hours as he watched the tasters for signs of distress. Several tasters collapsed from nervous exhaustion, which only reinforced Ferdinand's belief in constant assassination attempts. This surveillance state extended to the entire court. He rotated his personal guards daily, subjected ministers to absurd loyalty tests, and created an atmosphere where a careless word meant imprisonment. His relationship with the infant Isabella was a torment of pathological anxiety. He both loved her as his heir and resented her as the living proof of his sexual failure. He spent hours staring at her, searching for resemblances, and commissioned artists to paint her, comparing the images to portraits of himself and Maria Cristina's rumored lovers. He consulted genealogists and physiognomists, demanding they provide scientific proof of her legitimacy, a task that forced scholars into desperate creativity to preserve their own lives. The cost was staggering. The Crown spent enormous sums on spy networks, security measures, and loyalty investigations, while Spain's treasury emptied. Ferdinand's health deteriorated under the constant stress, marked by chronic insomnia, digestive problems, and a persistent tremor. His speeches became rambling accusations against unnamed enemies. In 1833, Ferdinand VII, the king who was both perpetrator and victim of a poisoned bloodline, finally found peace through the simple expedient of death. The official cause was gout, but palace physicians knew he had died of exhaustion, physical, psychological, and spiritual. The secret autopsy revealed the full, tragic scope of nature's cruel joke. His member, preserved for study, measured an astounding 14 inches, with dramatic variations in girth, exactly as described. More tellingly, it showed internal scarring and deformity that made normal function impossible. Most heartbreaking of all was the evidence of deliberate self-harm dating to his teenage years. Pathetic, secret attempts at self-surgery with whatever tools he could find. Efforts that only worsened his condition and deepened his psychological wounds. This anatomical legacy, along with detailed drawings, was sealed in the Vatican archives, deemed too disturbing and politically sensitive for public knowledge, one of history's most bizarre state secrets. Ferdinand's death ended his personal agony, but cemented his catastrophic legacy. He left behind a Spain torn apart by civil war, economic collapse, and international humiliation. Isabella II inherited a fractured kingdom, her questionable paternity a symbol of the decay Ferdinand embodied. His story is a stark reminder of how individual psychological damage can metastasize into national trauma, how private shame can become public disaster, and how the most intimate human failures can echo through history, determining the fate of millions. The preserved organ was more than a medical curiosity. It was a monument to the destructive power of shame and the tragic waste of human potential. A king who finally found peace only after ensuring his kingdom would have none. And so, we close the chapter on one of history's most tragic and twisted monarchs, a man whose personal curse became a national catastrophe. These stories, hidden in the shadows of official records, remind us that the past is never as simple as it seems. If you've made it this far into the forgotten corridors of history with us, you clearly have a curious mind. If you haven't already, please consider subscribing to the channel. By subscribing, you become part of our community of quiet historians, and you ensure you don't miss our next journey into the past. We have so many more forgotten stories, strange artifacts, and enigmatic figures to explore together. We leave you with this question. What other secrets are waiting to be uncovered? What other whispers from the past demand to be heard? We will be searching for them, and we hope you'll join us for the next discovery. Until then, thank you for listening. Take care, and we'll see you in the next video.